Museum Tram Tour. My name is David. I'm going to be your tram driver and tour guide today. A couple of things before we get started. This is a non-stop tour, so please remain seated during the whole tour. Please keep your arms and legs inside the tram, and please silence your cell phones. Pima Air and Space Museum opened its doors back in 1976. Right now we cover more than 80 acres. We have more than 400 aircraft on display. Today I'm going to highlight some of our unique and historic military, commercial, civilian, and search and rescue aircraft that we have in our collection. And we're going to start right here. So on both sides of the tram, we have most of our collection of Navy and Marine Corps jets. Many of these are carrier-based planes that perform the same jobs as the land-based combat planes, fighters, and bombers, but also have to incorporate strengthened structures to withstand the forces of being catapulted off carrier decks and yanked to a stop when landing on the ships. Taking off and landing on ships is one of the most difficult jobs an aviator can have. The runway is only 500 feet long. There are only 4 cables stretched across it to catch and hold the bottom of the plane. Add in the fact that the runway is moving away from you at 35 miles an hour and bouncing up and down as much as 30 feet at a time. Studies have shown that landing on an aircraft carrier is more stressful for a pilot than being shot at in combat. And Tom Cruise made it look so easy. Speaking of old Maverick in his most recent movie, on the left side of the tram, we have the McDonnell Douglas FA-18 Hornet. That's the plane on the left side in the Blue Angels colors of blue and gold. The Hornet is currently one of the fighters used by both the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps. They've been in service since the early 1980s, and later versions are expected to remain in use for the foreseeable future. This particular one flew with the U.S. Navy's Blue Angels aerobatic team for several years before it was retired in 2013. All right, next plane is going to be on the left side of the tram there. We're going to take a look at the EA-6B Prowler. This is the gray aircraft with the long tube coming out of its nose. This is an electronic warfare aircraft designed to jam, destroy, or confuse enemy radars. This Prowler has a unique and local history. In the late 1990s, the Marines needed more Prowlers. One of the ways they got them was to refurbish old aircraft and put them back into service. For this particular plane, 3 Prowlers were removed from the boneyard over across the street here, and their parts were combined into this one aircraft. This plane went into service in 2004, and because of the way it was built from the parts of several aircraft, it got the nickname Franken-Prowler. The next group of aircraft I want to talk about are going to be most of our collection of military trainers. These are going to be on the right side of the tram. The one I want to highlight for you first is the 2-seat trainer version of Great Britain's first jet fighter called the Gloucester Meteor. The Meteor is on the right side of the tram in the brown and dark blue camouflage. Meteors were the only Allied jet to see combat in World War II. The 2-seat trainer like this one was introduced after World War II in 1948, and over 700 trainers ended up being built for Great Britain and 7 other foreign militaries. This particular one was restored using the nose of a night fighter because the original trainer nose was missing when our museum acquired the plane. As I mentioned, on the right side of the tram here is most of our collection of military trainers. So we'll roll along and take a look at them here. Military trainers generally have 2 seats, one for an instructor and one for the student. Prospective pilots are first instructed in the basics of the science of flight, like how to take off, land, and control a plane in the air. This training is often conducted in small propeller-driven aircraft. Once the basics are mastered, pilots move up to more sophisticated, faster, and often jet-powered aircraft. At this stage, they begin to learn the basics of high-speed flight and aerial combat. It's not until the pilots start to train in the actual plane they'll be flying when they learn their combat techniques and how to employ their weapon system. While many trainers are specifically designed for that role, others are modified or adapted from other aircraft. The Sepacat Jaguar is the pink plane on the right side of the tram. This is one that a lot of people are curious about, particularly because of its color. It was originally intended as a two-seat supersonic jet trainer and light attack aircraft. In the end, though, the Jaguar was designed as a single-seat interceptor with nuclear capability. They entered service with the French Air Force and the British Royal Air Force in the early 1970s. This particular one flew with the British Royal Air Force during the First Gulf War. The unique color of this plane is known as desert pink, and the color provided effective camouflage during the operations in the desert sands of the Middle East. The yellow and black plane on the right side of the tram is a Fokker C-31 troop ship. This is the militarized version of the F-27 friendship airliner that was designed in the Netherlands. This is one of two that were delivered to the United States Army to be used by the U.S. Army Golden Knights parachute demonstration team, and it was in use with that team from 1985 until 2018. Members of the Golden Knights perform at air shows and competitions around the world, as well as take celebrities and heads of state on tandem jumps, including former President George H.W. Bush in 2004. All right, the next collection of aircraft we're going to look at are going to be on the right side of the tram, and these are most of our collection of VIP transports. These aircraft are used to provide transportation to high-ranking military officers and government officials. They are generally commercial airliners that have been fitted with modified executive seating. The first one of the VIP transports I want to talk about is right here on the right side of the tram. This is a triple-tailed Lockheed Constellation, or what the Air Force called a VC-121. This plane was used by General Dwight Eisenhower when he was commander of Allied forces in Europe after World War II. He named it Columbine after the state flower of Colorado because his wife was born in Colorado and he was married in Colorado. You can see the flower represented on the nose of the plane. The green VH-34 Choctaw helicopter on the right side of the tram is an Army VIP transport helicopter. This helicopter carried Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson between 1960 and 1964. Beginning in 1964, all presidential helicopter operations were transferred to the U.S. Marine Corps instead of the Army. That's why it's called Marine One now. Choctaws remained in use as cargo and transport helicopters until their retirement from military service in 1974. All right, the next two VIP transports I want to talk about are going to be on the right side of the tram, and these have both used the call sign Air Force One, meaning they have both been used to carry United States presidents. The first one on the right side of the tram here is the military adaptation of the Boeing 707 airliner, which the Air Force called a VC-137. This plane was introduced to the presidential aircraft fleet in 1959 and is the second of 5 VC-137s to serve the executive branch. During most of this plane's service life, it was used to carry large groups of VIPs, but it did carry President Kennedy on at least one occasion. This plane's real claim to fame, though, is that back in 1981, this plane was used to bring the 52 American hostages held at the embassy in Iran back to the U.S. after their release. On this occasion, the aircraft used the call sign Freedom 1. This call sign was used again 10 years later in 1991 when the plane was used to carry American prisoners of war back from Iraq at the end of the Gulf War. And just before its retirement, this plane also served as Air Force 2, carrying Vice President Al Gore. The next Air Force One on the right side of the tram here is a Douglas VC-118 Liftmaster. This plane is based on the Douglas DC-6 airliner. It's the last propeller-driven aircraft to be assigned as the primary aircraft of the President of the United States. This plane served both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. While both presidents preferred to fly on the larger, faster, jet-powered VC-137s like we just saw, this aircraft was kept because many airports at the time were too small for the big jets. So this smaller aircraft remained important to the Air Force One fleet. As we round the corner here, if you look to the right side of the tram, you can see a small aircraft with the numbers N12774 painted on the side. This is a Cessna 172 Skyhawk. The reason we want to point this aircraft out and why it's even in our collection is because it's the most produced aircraft in history. Cessna delivered the first production model back in 1956, and as of 2018, more than 44,000 of them have been built, and they're still in production today. On the right side of the tram are two later versions of the F-86 Sabre, the United States' first swept-wing fighter jet that was put into service during the Korean War to compete with the Soviet-designed MiG-15. The H version with the black and yellow tail markings features a larger fuselage and updated weaponry. It's also the last non-radar equipped Sabre that was put into service. The L version with the blue and white tail markings was a radar equipped version of the Sabre. Notice the different shape of its nose. That accommodates the radar equipment. And as we roll along here, if you look to the left side of the tram, you can see a tan building. Inside that building is a fully restored B-17 bomber and a lot of really interesting historic memorabilia from the 390th Bomb Group that actually flew B-17s. While that museum is not a part of our museum, admission to you is free, and I strongly encourage you to go and check out that beautiful plane and all that really interesting history that goes with it. Okay, the next group of airplanes I want to talk about are going to be on the left side of the tram. These are our Harriers. This is a collection of various versions of the vertical takeoff and landing jet fighter. Originally designed by Hawker Aviation in the United Kingdom, the Harrier was adopted by the British military and the U.S. Marine Corps in the 1970s. 4 rotating nozzles under the wings direct the exhaust from the engine downward for vertical flight. The silver aircraft in the middle of the row, the one with the 0 on the nose, is one of the experimental Kestrel prototypes that was tested in 1964 and ultimately led to the first production Harriers in 1969. The other aircraft, all of which were built in England, served in the British Royal Navy, Air Force, or with the U.S. Marine Corps. All right, the next group of aircraft I want to cover are going to be our early supersonic jet fighters. The introduction of jet engines at the end of World War II brought the quest for ever faster speeds for fighter plane development in the 1950s and the 1960s. The military at that time de-emphasized maneuverability of the dogfight era and instead emphasized long-range missiles for air-to-air combat. A couple of great examples of this design philosophy are the 2 light gray colored aircraft on the right side of the tram. The F-102 Delta Dagger has the red markings on the tail, and the F-106 Delta Dart has the yellow tail markings. Both of these aircraft were designed as high-speed interceptors, which mean their mission was to fly out at supersonic speeds to intercept enemy bombers before they could reach the coasts of the United States. The plane's triangular or delta-shaped wings are very efficient at high speeds, but make it significantly less maneuverable than planes with other wing types. Okay, now I want to switch back to the left side of the tram and slightly behind us. That's not really a part of the tour. So back there on the left side, slightly behind us, we have a brown and green camouflaged airplane with a red star on the side. This is another supersonic jet fighter from the 1960s. This is the F-4 Phantom. Originally designed as a high-speed interceptor for the U.S. Navy, the Phantom's design proved to be more adaptable than the F-102 or F-106 that we just looked at. For this reason, the Air Force also adopted the Phantom, using it in both air-to-air combat and for bombing ground targets. The Phantom was originally designed without a gun and relies solely on missiles for combat against other aircraft. However, combat in Vietnam and the Middle East quickly showed that the era of the dogfight had not ended after all. While this large and fast but less maneuverable airplane was at a disadvantage compared to the Soviet Union's fighters that were quicker turning but slower than the Phantom, American pilots overcame the Phantom's deficiencies with better training and superior tactics. This allowed it to become one of the most successful and widely used strike fighters ever. As we turn the corner here, if you look to the right side of the tram at the silver aircraft with the red lightning bolt on the side, you'll see one of the United States' first jet fighters to go into production. This is the P-80 Shooting Star. All major powers on both sides of World War II worked to develop jet-powered combat aircraft during the war. Germany was the first to fly a jet-powered aircraft in 1939. By 1944, Germany, Great Britain, and the U.S. had all designed their first combat jets. While the British and Germans both put jets into combat during World War II, the U.S. jets like the P-80 did not see combat until the 1950s during the Korean War, where they were used for air support of ground troops. And just for a little museum orientation, as we roll along here, on the left side of the tram coming up is hangar number 3. In front of us is hangar number 4, and to the left of hangar 4 is hangar 5. All 3 of those hangars contain great examples of World War II aircraft. In addition, beyond hangar 4 and 5, we have another large area with outdoor aircraft displays. On the left side of the tram, you'll see a rather unusual looking plane that's missing a lot of parts. This is the Budd RB-1 Conestoga that was built during World War II. The U.S. government at that time believed there'd be a shortage of aluminum available to build aircraft, so they sought designs for aircraft made from what were called non-strategic materials. This generally referred to wood, but the Budd company who built railway cars experimented with spot-welded stainless steel, and there was early interest from the Army and the Navy. However, the expected aluminum shortage never developed, and only 17 of these Conestogas were ever built. This particular one started out life with the U.S. Navy, then it was used by some freight companies in Mexico, and was eventually abandoned for many years at the airport in Douglas, Arizona. It was donated to our museum in its current condition back in 1978. We're still looking for the rest of the parts. The next group of aircraft I want to highlight are going to be on the right side of the tram. These are light civil aircraft from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. All these aircraft were designed and built to provide personal transportation for individuals. Some of these planes were actually sold as kits. Their pilots would build themselves in their own backyards. The military also used some of these small transport aircraft for pilots who had been assigned to non-flying duties to help them keep up on their flight skills. The yellow plane on the right side of the tram is another category of aircraft we like to highlight on the tour. This is a Snow S2A crop duster. Aircraft such as this are vital to the agricultural industry. They're used to spray fertilizers and pesticides on crops and farmlands. The flying involved in aerial application or crop dusting is technically challenging and occasionally hazardous. Pilots who fly these aircraft are highly trained in all aspects of aerial application, from safe pesticide use and entomology to near aerobatic flight skills. Okay, now I'd like to direct your attention to the left side of the tram. Over there we have a collection of airliners from the 1940s and 50s. The one I want to highlight for you is called the Vickers Viscount airliner. That's the one on the left side, maybe slightly behind us, with the 4 propellers on it. The Vickers Viscount was the world's first turboprop airliner. It was designed and built by Vickers Armstrong of Great Britain. 445 of these Viscounts were made between 1948 and 1964, and the aircraft flew for over 60 years, with the last Viscount retiring in 2008. The plane you're looking at was the first turboprop airliner in all of North America. It flew from Toronto to New York City for Trans-Canada Airlines, holding 40 to 63 passengers and a crew of 3 to 4. If you look to the right side of the tram at the airplane with the yellow wings and the gray body, you'll see the Sikorsky S-43 Baby Clipper. This is an airliner from the 1930s, but it was also used by the Navy and the Marine Corps. In the 1930s, many airliners were designed as seaplanes because airports were not common, but lakes, rivers, and oceans made useful substitutes. The Baby Clipper could hold 15 passengers and a crew of 3. This particular plane flew for Inter-Island Airways in Hawaii in the 1930s and 40s. It later flew in Alaska, where it was damaged in an accident in the 1950s and spent the next 30 years at the bottom of a lake. It was recovered by a member of the U.S. Marine Corps, hence its paint job, and was restored and later loaned to our museum. And speaking of restoration, if you look to the left side of the tram as we roll along here, you'll see a rather large warehousey hangar kind of building. That's where our museum's restoration team does their magic of turning these relics that we acquire into the displays that you get to see. So after World War II, more airports were available, and we saw the next generation of airliners take shape. One of the great examples of this era of airliner is the Lockheed Constellation, or Connie. The Connie is the silver plane on the right side of the tram with the Trans World Airliner, TWA, in red. It was one of the first long-range civilian airliners to go into service after the war. It carried between 44 and 81 passengers and a crew of 6. The aircraft you're looking at is the 10th Connie that was ever built, and it's the oldest one still left in the world. It flew briefly with the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1946 and was then returned to Lockheed and resold to TWA, where it flew from 1947 to 1961. So as I mentioned, the Constellation was one of the first post-war airliners to go into service. If you look to the right side of the tram, you can see a giant white airliner with ANA on the tail. This is one of the most recent airliners to go into service. This is a Boeing 787 Dreamliner. This is the first jet airliner not constructed of aluminum. Instead, it's nearly 80% carbon fiber composites. This, along with new advances in engines and wing shape, make it one of the most fuel-efficient and cost-effective jet airliners ever built. The one you're looking at is the second Dreamliner ever produced. It participated with other prototypes in the aircraft testing and certification process that lasted from 2009 until 2011. It carries the markings of All Nippon Airlines, or ANA, which was the first airline to buy the new aircraft. It can hold 242 passengers and a crew of 8. Okay, we're now moving on from our collection of commercial airliners to cargo aircraft used mainly by the military. Development of military cargo planes focuses on the size of the plane, as the military needs planes that can deliver large amounts of supplies, equipment, and troops. The plane on the left side of the tram is a Douglas C-54 Skymaster. These cargo planes are based off the DC-4 airliner. The first Skymasters actually started as commercial airliners, but were commandeered by the Army Air Forces in early 1942. Request for the cargo version soon followed. C-54s are probably best known for participating in the Berlin airlift that took place between June of 1948 and September of 49. In one of the largest humanitarian efforts ever, 2.3 million tons of food, medicine, fuel, and other supplies were delivered to West Berlin, mostly in C-54s. The C-54 you're looking at actually participated in the Berlin airlift from September of 48 to January of 49. The two identical aircraft on the left side of the tram are the C-130 Hercules, one of the most popular cargo planes. These cargo planes have been in military and civilian use since the 1950s, and advanced versions of them are still in production today. The green one is an example of the first version of the plane. The gray one with the orange on the nose was specifically modified to deliver supplies to the research stations at the North and South Poles by using the large skis you see on the landing gear for taking off and landing in the snow. The small little aircraft that's between the two C-130s is a Vietnam-era reconnaissance drone called a Firebee. It's no accident that we have the Firebee displayed between the two C-130s, because when the Firebee was in service, it was launched from and controlled by C-130s. So the military is not the only government organization that needs to move large objects. NASA also has a need for very large cargo planes. If you look to the right side of the tram, you'll see the Super Guppy, the very large white aircraft with the inflated fuselage. It was built by combining parts from a Boeing 377 airliner and an Air Force C-97 for NASA in the 1960s. This is the first Guppy out of 5 that were built. They were used to carry sections of rockets, the Apollo space capsules, moon landers, and even whole other airplanes. The last cargo this particular Guppy carried before it was retired was the Hubble Space Telescope. This Super Guppy was used by NASA until 1991, when it was retired in favor of new Super Guppies. And if you're thinking it also kind of looks like a whale, the European version of that category of aircraft is actually called the Blue Guppy. If you look to the left side of the tram at the plane with the red crosses on the tail and the wings, you'll see one of the types of plane the Super Guppy was built from. This is the C-97 Stratofreighter by Boeing. The Boeing C-97 was developed after request by the U.S. Army Air Forces for a transport aircraft based on the B-29 bomber. It first flew in 1945 and proved to be a very successful and versatile aircraft. So much so that Boeing modified the design slightly to create their first post-war airliner, the Boeing 377, the other plane the Guppy was made from. In 1969, the aircraft you're looking at here was loaned to the International Red Cross to fly relief supplies into Nigeria during the Civil War. That's why it has the red crosses on it. While airplanes are used in all different capacities in the military, one of the greatest restrictions on airplanes is how far they can fly before they need to land and refuel. Efforts to develop a way to refuel planes in the air began in the 1920s, However, it wasn't until the 1950s that a practical system for aerial refueling was developed. If you look to your left, you can see several aerial refueling aircraft, like the KB-50 Super Fortress. That's the polished silver aircraft with the 4 propellers on it there. KB-50 is also pretty unique for our collection in that it's a tanker version of the B-50 bomber. The B-50 was actually an upgraded version of the B-29 bomber. There's only 5 examples of a B-50 left in the world, and you just saw one of them. If you look to the right side of the tram as we roll along here, you can get a different perspective on that goofy looking Super Guppy. The 2 large lumps on the side of the fuselage up by the cockpit, those are actually engines. The whole front end of that airplane opens up so they can load their massive cargoes. While being able to refuel in the air is important, the military also needs a way to detect approaching aircraft. Since World War II, the primary method of detecting approaching aircraft has been radar. Because radar only works in line of sight, the higher up the antenna is, the farther it can see. On the right side of the tram is an aircraft developed for Great Britain to carry radar antennas. You can see the large radome under the nose of the aircraft that houses the radar. This dark gray plane is called the Avro Shackleton. It's also unique because of the use of contra-rotating propellers, in which 2 propellers in line with each other turn in opposite directions. This makes the propellers more efficient and provides more power than one single propeller. And also coming up on the right side of the tram is another version of the Lockheed Constellation. This one also has a giant radome underneath it. Right, now we're going to move back to the left side of the tram where we're going to see some of our collection of long-range bombers. Long-range strategic bombing was developed during World War I as a way to attack military and industrial targets far away from the front lines of battle. The small and ineffective raids of World War I gave way to the huge air battles of World War II, with thousands of aircraft battling through the skies of Europe and Asia. The development of the atomic bomb at the end of World War II gave new importance to the development of even larger and longer ranged bombers. The first of the post-war bombers to enter service with the U.S. Air Force is the giant aircraft over here on the left side of the tram. This is the B-36 Peacemaker. It's the largest bomber to ever serve in the U.S. Air Force and used 6 of the most powerful piston engines ever developed. The B-36 was the last propeller-driven strategic bomber used by the United States. It went into service in 1949, but it was already becoming obsolete, and its replacement flew only 3 years later in 1952. The B-36 you just looked at is one of the last B-36s that was built, and it is the last one that ever flew. And in order to keep it relevant, they kept adding engines to it. So you notice it has 6 giant piston engines. It also has 4 jet engines on it. If you want to see one of those giant piston engines, we have one on display in Hangar 5 and a cutaway training version of one in Hangar 1. The next bomber I want to highlight is on the left side of the tram here. This is a B-52 Stratofortress. This is a later version of the plane that was introduced in 1959 and served until 1994. This particular aircraft served in the 1991 Gulf War with Iraq and participated in what was at the time the longest combat mission ever flown in history. On the first night of the Gulf War in January 1991, this aircraft and several others flew from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana non-stop to Iraq and back, launching cruise missiles at targets near Baghdad. In all, the planes were refueled 4 times in the air and flew for a total of 35 hours. All right, the next bomber I want to talk about on the left side of the tram is another version of the B-52. This version began flying in 1956 and was the main version of the aircraft used in the Vietnam War. They were painted this way with black on the bottom and green camouflage on top, since most of their missions over North Vietnam were flown at night. The last B-52 left the assembly line in 1962. Today, 58 of them remain in active service, and they're expected to serve until 2050, giving them a potential service life of nearly 100 years. On the right side of the tram, we have a collection of foreign aircraft. These were built outside the U.S. Aircraft represented here were built in China, France, Germany, Great Britain, Poland, and the Soviet Union. They consist of trainers, fighters, and fighter bombers. Since it's St. Patrick's Day, we have to highlight the Poland Gnat. That's the bright green plane on the right side of the tram. It was designed as a trainer for the British Royal Air Force and the Leprechaun Air Force in 1959. This is one of 4 that were built and tested before the aircraft actually went into production. The Gnat served as the primary jet trainer until 1979. Next to the Gnat is the Alpha Jet. This one carries the markings of the West German Air Force, where they were used as close air support fighter bombers. They were also used as trainers in the French Air Force. The Alpha Jet represents the Europeans' answer to the expanding cost of developing military aircraft during the 1970s. It was developed as a joint venture by aircraft manufacturers in both France and West Germany. Most Western European military aircraft since then have been developed as part of collaborations between 2 or more countries. This spreads the development costs amongst the countries and ensures a larger number of aircraft sales in the process. All right, the last bomber I want to highlight for you today is on the left side of the tram. That's the sleek silver Delta winged aircraft. This plane is known as the B-58 Hustler. The B-58's claim to fame is it is the United States' first supersonic bomber. Only 116 of these were ever made, and what you're looking at is the last one to come off the production line back in 1962. On the right side of the tram, we have a whole row of Soviet-designed jet fighters. The earliest and first in the row is a 2-seat MiG-15 trainer dating from the 1950s. This is the one with the 038 on the nose and the Polish markings. The latest and last in the row is a MiG-29 interceptor that was introduced in the late 1980s and is still being flown by some former Soviet republics. While all the aircraft in this row were designed in the Soviet Union, many of the examples we have in our collection were actually built in China or Poland. That's the MiG-29 coming up on the right side with the twin tails. All right, now I'd like to direct your attention to the left side of the tram, where we have most of our museum's collection of helicopters. Initially developed in the 1930s, helicopters are designed to take off and land vertically, thus eliminating the need for large open areas. They have found extensive use in the military for carrying troops, cargo, and as armed gunships. Civilian operators have also found helicopters valuable for many different jobs, including law enforcement, search and rescue, air ambulance, firefighting, and cargo shipments. Also on the left side of the tram is a green helicopter with a red cross on the nose. This is the Bell UH-1 Huey, which is one of the most widely used and popular helicopters. The Huey was introduced by the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War, and it became one of the symbols of America's involvement in that war. This particular one is marked as a medical evacuation aircraft responsible for taking wounded soldiers from the battlefield to hospitals. The use of these helicopters saved the lives of many soldiers who would have died before they could reach treatment, if the medevac helicopters had not been available. One of the largest heavy-lift helicopters developed by the United States Army is on the right side of the tram, and it's known as the Sky Crane. In the 1960s, The Army was looking for a heavy lift helicopter capable of carrying large objects such as artillery pieces, small vehicles, and large amounts of other cargo. This helicopter is capable of carrying 27,000 pounds. Since their retirement from the military in the early 90s, the Sky Crane has seen extensive use in fighting forest fires and in the logging and construction industries. And if you look to the left side of the tram, you look beyond the helicopters, you can see some rather colorful aircraft back there. Those airplanes were all destined for the scrapyard, but some local professional artists decided to use them as their canvases to highlight their different artistic styles. Now we use them as yard art here at the entrance to the museum. The orange and white helicopter on the left side of the tram might look familiar. This is generally called a twin Huey because they were upgraded to have two engines and a larger, longer cabin than the original Huey that we just saw. This particular helicopter started out life as a VIP transport for the U.S. Marine Corps. In May of 1987, it also carried President Ronald Reagan during the G7 summit in Venice, Italy. In 1990, it was converted and it was assigned to the Marine Corps Air Station in Yuma, Arizona. Here it worked as a search and rescue helicopter until it was retired in 2020. All right, folks, well, that concludes our tour for the day. I want to thank you for riding with us. And hey, I also want to remind you, in case you didn't know or you haven't been yet, we also operate the Titan Missile Museum about 30 miles from here down in Green Valley. This is the only remaining Titan II missile silo anywhere, and through the tour you can go underground and see where the Air Force actually operated the facility and see an actual Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile. I think if you like this museum, you'll like that one too. So again, thanks for riding with us today. Please enjoy the rest of your day here at the museum.